I want to ask you a question. Do you believe that Sunil Gavaskar should still be playing Test cricket right now? Because at one stage, he was one of the greatest players in the world. And he completely and utterly deserved his chance to be representing India at the top of the game. So surely if he continued to want to play all the way through in his career, he should have been allowed to. That makes perfect sense, right? Except for the fact that it's absolutely absurd, because when Sunil Gavaskar was one of the best players in the world, he was picked for his nation. Then as he got older and he wasn't able to do that anymore, he decided to retire. Now, if he hadn't retired, someone eventually would have just said, I'm sorry, Sunil, you're averaging 12 for the last 5 years. In Sunil Gavaskar's case, he retired. He was happy to do so. But let's say he just kept playing all the way through the 90s, all the way through the 2000s. He got to the point where he was making like a run a game on average. Someone eventually would tap him on the shoulder and say, I'm not sure you really should be in this team anymore. That makes sense. That is what professional sport is. But that, of course, is exactly what we do in Test cricket. Teams played in 1877 against each other, and they have got Test status for life, no matter how well or poorly they play, as England tried to prove in the 80s and 90s. South Africa got Test status largely on the back of the fact that English people liked to holiday there in the 1890s. They have remained in Test cricket ever since, with a small hiatus when bilaterally teams stopped playing them. That wasn't even an official ban. And they're still a Test nation today. They would be a Test nation today if they were really poor or if they were really good. None of these things matter. It doesn't matter for the West Indies, it doesn't matter for New Zealand, it doesn't matter for India, it doesn't matter for Pakistan, for Sri Lanka. If you are good at Test cricket, it has nothing to do with the fact that you are a Test cricket nation. That is because Test cricket is not done on merit. It is run like a private gentleman's club from like hundreds of years ago in the UK. You get your membership, and then unless you do something absolutely heinous like what South Africa did, eventually you might lose your membership for a short period of time before you get it back again anyway. No one really knows how to become a Test nation. There isn't a system where you can just be this good for this long and then suddenly you get it. Some teams like Bangladesh or New Zealand probably got Test status partly because of political pressures as much as anything else at that point. Other teams who deserved it for a very long time, like say Sri Lanka, had to wait and wait and wait. It's not done on merit. It's not done on how good you are at cricket. It's really just down to the fact that if you're in the right place at the right time, you might become a Test nation. And if not, you're just with the others. Modern non-Test teams don't actually know exactly what they need to do to become Test teams. Test cricket as a structure is classist, political, and really kind of stupid. And this is why cricket as a whole has not grown the way it should have. People don't really understand it because we don't even really understand it. But we just had a big bit of news drop, thanks to Dan Brettig at The Age, and we are now talking about 2 tiers in Test cricket again. This is something that I talk about quite a lot, but it's very rarely in the news. And now it is, so we're going to jump on it. The question at the moment is, should we have tiered Test cricket? A few years ago, I realized that trying to find the best stories in cricket was impossible for any fan. I even tried to get funding to make my own cricket Huffington Post. It never quite worked. But luckily, we finally have someone filling this massive void in our game. Best of Cricket. They scour the publications everywhere to find, quite simply, all the best news and the greatest stories on our sport. Then they make it just as easy. They either email it or WhatsApp it direct to you. Cricket's greatest tales delivered to your device. This is truly the best of cricket. Now, we obviously already have kind of 2 kinds of tiered Test cricket happening right at the moment, because there are Test teams and there are non-Test teams. Tier 1 and tier who gives a shit. And of course, there's another way of looking at it as well. We have 2 tiers within our system. We have World Test Championship tier, and we don't really know what the other tier is. It's just not World Test Championship. But what the conversation is about now is more of a formal structure of this tier system. And that's what we wanted to look at in this particular video. Up here, we have tiered tests. Let's go with a very simple yes or no answer. Should we have tiered tests? Let's go no. We should not have tiered tests. What we are then creating is a Super League. You could argue that Test cricket has actually always been a Super League because there is no way to get dropped out of it unless for that brief moment when Zimbabwe wasn't playing many tests, but that was more to do with the actual structure of their board, or as we mentioned before, when South Africa refused to play teams that weren't white. So realistically, we have always had a Super League within Test cricket. We just don't call it that. And part of the reason we don't call it that is it's not actually a league, is it? It's just bilateral agreements, but the way it comes together is a bit more like a Super League than anything else. So let's say we say no to the Super League idea. That leaves us with the status quo. We've been here. We know what the status quo is like. All of us have lived through the status quo. The status quo has got us in this weird state in cricket where we have this gentleman's club version of the game rather than a sport that grows naturally because it's just a really good sport. So I think most people would argue, and do on a nearly daily basis, that the status quo doesn't make any sense. Angelo Matthews the other day came out and said it was ridiculous how many test matches Sri Lanka were playing. Angelo Matthews directed that ire at the ICC. The ICC has nothing to do with test cricket, right? The status quo is bilateral agreements between boards. It is his board that he should be upset with. Even the players don't know who to be upset with. That is the status quo. There's too much cricket being played, too many different things happening at the same time. No one's in charge of this as well. The status quo is terrible. It's got us this far. Let's just be happy that test cricket's been so good that we can live with this, but obviously no one would like that. So let's go back to a Super League and let's say yes to the Super League, right? It will lead to quite a lot of money. There is no doubt about it. If you get a situation where the best teams are playing each other over and over again, and those are in the biggest TV or streaming markets, those are going to be the ones that are going to make the most money for us. So that would be an absolutely huge thing for cricket. But the question really then is, where does that money go? We'll come back to one of those answers before. But let's say the money just goes to the teams who are playing in it, right? That leads us back to this, heritage. That is essentially what Test cricket has been. There is a link between the status quo and heritage. This is a heritage sport. If you don't know what that means, let me explain it this way. It's not a sport where we're trying to get more and more people to watch it. It's essentially a sport where we're trying to stop it from growing and just going to the same audience again and again. So for instance, recently, Jaguar was in the news because they're trying to market their cars to a new audience. Why are they trying to do that? Because generations Jag would only sell cars to the same kind of people again and again and again. They were a heritage product. Then one day, a whole new generation of the kinds of people they used to sell cars to no longer actually would buy their cars because it was seen as an old brand that their grandfathers and their fathers liked. And Jags are usually aimed at men. So a whole new generation was like, I don't think we want to be involved with that. And so they stopped doing it. So Jaguar now are having to try and pivot and make themselves a more relevant brand. That is what a heritage product is. That is what not having tiered test cricket leads to. It leads to either the status quo or a Super League where we can make more money, but we're not actually growing the game at all. Essentially, these two things is what we've been playing with forever. We already know this, we've been there. It's time to look at something slightly different. Okay, so tiered test, let's say yes. Now for that to work, we need promotion and relegation. Because if we don't have promotion and relegation, we can have tiered tests, but it just comes back at a Super League. So the first thing that we need to look at here is promotion and relegation. Otherwise, what is the point of that? We might as well just say these couple of teams are going to play. Otherwise, what is the point of that? We might as well just say that we're creating a whole new league and everyone else who's not already making a lot of money from Test cricket doesn't matter. So there has to be promotion and relegation. And I think there's two clear options with promotion and relegation. The first is 3 tiers. And you won't have heard this very much unless you've been following some of my work. I talk about it all the time, but in general, it's not the most common one. Most people talk about 2 tiers, and we'll get to 2 tiers in one moment. But let's talk about 3 tiers. Your first question will be, Jared, we only have 12 test teams. Are we going to have 4 test teams in each tier? Obviously not. That would not work. We're not going to do that. In the 3-tiered system, we would probably have either 6 or 7 teams in each division. So let's say 18 teams to make it easy for now. You would have 18 teams, and then you would have playoffs between Division 1, Division 2, and Division 3. So the 6th best team would have to beat the 7th best team to stay in Division 1. This is part of the reason that we don't have tiers at the moment. There was a bunch of teams who complained about that system beforehand when it was originally mentioned. I've not invented that this tiers thing isn't new. It was talked about almost a decade ago when the World Test Championship was first being discussed. The issue at that time was a few of the smaller teams who were worried that they would then slip into the 2nd division and therefore not be relevant anymore. Boo-hoo. That is what professional sport should be about. You should be trying to win to stay at the top level. Not just because someone 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 80 years ago, 150 years ago decided that you should get test status. You should constantly have to be proving that you are in the best sides. That is how sport works. So that's one reason why the 18 sides might be a bit of a tough sell. You could also change it to 21 if you want. It doesn't really matter. So you might be looking at that and going, well, wait a minute, if we only have 12 sides, how do we get to 18 or 21 with test status? Well, I think the easiest way here is to give every single nation in the world who wants to play test cricket status. We've already done it with T20 cricket. And the biggest thing I always hear is people say things like, oh, won't someone think of the stats? I am the stats. I speak for the stats. I don't speak for the stats. There's lots of statisticians who disagree. Do you know what statisticians and analysts and mathematicians do? We filter things. We're filtering things all the time. When we look at a bowler to see how good they are, we might look at them against the top order and then the lower order. When we're looking to see how good a bowler is in T20 cricket, we might look at how many wickets they take early compared to how many cheap ones they get late. We are always filtering. Anytime you see stats on our screen, they're probably filtered, right? We can filter tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. We can also filter, these are the teams with a winning record, and these are the teams with a losing record. We can also filter by, I don't know, every second letter in the alphabet. We have all those skills available to us. Don't worry about the stats. So if your biggest argument is you might end up with a player from Nepal who has the highest score in Test cricket, who cares, right? Because if that's the case, you'll say, yeah, but amongst Division 1 teams or legacy Test cricket, the actual highest score is still Brian Lara's. Doesn't mean that someone can't make 500 in Division 2. Guess what that will mean? People will be talking about that. People will be talking about someone from, I don't know, Nepal or Oman making a huge score in Test cricket. Do we not want people to talk about Test cricket? Give everyone status. Because as I talked about at the top, the original system, the status quo, the heritage, however you want to look at it, is flawed, is stupid. If you want to play a test match as a nation, you should be allowed to call it a test match and play it. The original test matches were not decided by like some grand arbiter or the ICC or even the ECB or Cricket Australia or Lords. It was literally by a journalist who just came along and went, that looked like a test match, test match. We have never had a great system in place. So let's give everyone test match status, and then you have 7 teams in Division 1, 7 teams in Division 2, 7 teams in Division 3, promotion and relegation between those, and then the teams below are playing to get to the point where they can get into the 3rd tier. It means any team in the world, if they consistently become successful, that means they can go from not playing Test cricket at all to playing in the World Test Championship final. Isn't that what sport is actually supposed to be? The answer to that is yes. That would give us this global growth. Global growth through test cricket, which we've never tried before because, you know, private men's club and all that sort of stuff. Actually allow the point where we allow test cricket to grow correctly and anyone can play test cricket. It doesn't matter if you are from Fiji or Mexico. If you are good at cricket, you can play test cricket. And if you get very good, you can go up the tiers. That is what we should be encouraging within our sport. It also would make it quite exciting. There will be people who only care about Division 2 and Division 3. There'll be people who care about the divisions below. Like, you'll be able to pick what kind of test cricket you want to follow at that point. There will be more test matches played as well. There will be more to market, more viral moments. People who've never played test cricket before will get a chance to do all that. I think this is really unlikely. But I think it's also the best possible situation. Opening up the game will lead to global growth. But we have to look at 2 tiers because 2 tiers is the most logical. It was the one that was discussed before, and with 12 teams there, it makes sense. I think it was Lisa Stalaker on the Willow Talk podcast who said there are 12 teams. If you just split that in the middle, you have 6 and 6, and England is currently ranked around 6th in the world. We're probably not going to see that. But one way or another, I expect us to see 2 tiers, probably of 14 teams, which means that we will get 2 extra sides available here. This is not terrible. But it starts to be a system for the worst team in Division 1 and the worst team in Division 2 to be pushed out if there are better, stronger teams coming through. That should always be the case. Because again, this is sport and not an 18th century gentleman's club. So let's say we go with the 2-tier system, which seems to be what Jay Shah is currently proposing. Will that lead to more money? Yes, it will. It will lead to a lot more money. And that's a really, really important thing for the game. Even the Super League would go for more money. It's just that we know that eventually that money might stop. 2 tiers would lead to more money as well. If the worst case situation happens and we only stay with about 12 or 14 teams, we're still going to end up with a bit of a heritage product, right? We're still going to end up with the same issue here, which is we're trying to sell people this thing that doesn't really grow or move, and not everyone is invited in from around the world. Like if you're the 4th best batter in the world and you're from America or Mozambique, bad luck. You can't play in any of this because you're not from a special country. It doesn't really make any sense. But the important thing here is what happens with the money. This would actually be the same case if we did like a Super League structure as well, but probably more so for this 2-tier situation. Because if the money just goes back into the heritage of the game, then eventually we still have that same issue that we were talking about before. There is another way of doing it. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing of making Test cricket into a league. I've talked about that many, many times before. That is still something that we should be looking at. But let's stop before that and just look at pooling the money. So if we pool the money, this actually helps on a few different levels. The big issue with Test cricket at the moment is it costs quite a lot of money, and then you have to do bilateral agreements. And essentially the only way to make that money back is by playing England sometimes, generally India, and Australia very occasionally. If the money from a 2-tiered situation went into a pool so that all the players were paid out of that pool, all the officials were paid out of that pool, all the grounds were paid out of that pool, we'd be in a situation then where it wouldn't actually cost the local boards all that much money to play Test cricket. And if you aggregated the TV rights, and this is a bit of a pipe dream, you would actually get a lot more money than you would from the bilateral agreements that you're currently doing. Like the status quo is actually losing money because it's not pooling all the resources, and we're not doing collective bargaining, we're doing individual bargaining. The World Cup is already done this way. The T20 World Cup is already done this way. The Women's World Cups are all done in the same way. There's no reason why Test cricket couldn't do that. And then all those other things of players, of umpires, of officials, of the grounds could be looked after by this pool. So say there was a small team who got status at the moment. I'm going to pick a random country at will. Uganda. So Uganda get Test status. They play really good. They go up through the 3-tier system. They even manage somehow to get into the 2-tier system. When they actually get to the 2nd tier, the money from the pool is helping them support their Test cricket, but also support the facilities and everything else so that it is a proper Test venue and that their players are paid for without the board having to pay for them directly. This is quite unlikely because we've had generations to do this in Test cricket, and we've decided again and again. Sometimes even the small teams have been against it, but generally it's been the kind of the Super League. We used to call them the Big Three, but let's call them the Super League for now, that have been the most against it. If we get to a point where just being good enough for Test cricket means you make it all the way through here and you don't have to worry about finances, you can just invest all of your money on being as good as you can in Test cricket, and you'll make more money because you're going to be playing against the bigger sides if you get to that level, and it's not draining your resources as well. That means that this team, in whichever direction they go, once they get access to this, it would give a direct pathway to global growth. Every single time, it would give a direct pathway to global growth, right? Because all you have to do is be good at cricket, keep getting good at cricket, and eventually there'll be some money, there'll be a pool there, and other teams will see that same thing, and the cycle can complete itself. If we don't do that, and we say no to the pool, we just come back to heritage again, right? We already see the flaw in that system. In fact, let's be honest, we've been there over and over and over again. The tiered Test system isn't perfect, and it will probably be implemented poorly, and I say that based as someone who's been working in cricket for 17 years, who's been alive for over 40 years watching the game of cricket, and is also a historian. Generally, when cricket has the opportunity to pick the right decisions, they go as far as they can away from it. But having a tiered system could really help our game. It could also go the complete other way and end up as a de facto Super League and ruin everything that we love about Test cricket at the moment. But let me say this, 2024 was, I would say, the most entertaining year of Test cricket in the history of our game. Certainly in my time, but I would say kind of throughout the entire timeline of our sport. So if we're ever going to be optimistic about Test cricket, and over the last couple of years, it's been mostly downs with a couple of ups, it would be this time. So let's try and make some decisions for the betterment of the game. A lot of people are just saying that tiered Test cricket is just about making money. Test cricket should make money. It needs money to survive. But let's make sure that that money is used to actually safeguard Test cricket and not just line the pockets of the wealthy boards. It took God and the demon to build international cricket, but don't tell Johnny Bairstow. 1882, Australia had played one Test in England against the god W.G. Grace, and they sucked. So they were playing him again, and it was a tough wicket. But England was in front, so Australia was desperate for a third innings lead. At number 8 was young all-rounder Sammy Jones. After a routine single, he walks down to do some gardening on the pitch. Grace whips off the bails and appeals. The ball wasn't dead, Jones was run out. The Australians were furious. In fact, some of the English players were also furious. But what Grace said went, and the umpires had already given it. Next in was Fred Spofforth. He was known as the Demon fast bowler. He was furious, and he let England know exactly what was coming next, which was maiden. There's 12 maidens. I can't count them all. England only needed 85 to win. W.G. Grace made 32. England only 77. That was the test where the Ashes began. Buy my book Overthrowing Cricket's Empire on Amazon today.